The minimum expectation, both from the point of view of the scientific community and from the point of view of civil society, is confirmation of the global yardstick for climate protection, that global warming should be kept below 2 centigrade. In the meantime, people have been giving the whole thing a lot of further thought. They are also asking, what process do I need? From a physical point of view, in order to guarantee that we don't miss this target, we must essentially reduce all greenhouse gas emissions to zero by the third quarter of this century, by some time after 2050. So far, so good. Policymakers could perhaps agree on this in Paris, because the day of reckoning would be a long way in the future. A process must be agreed that ensures that this development really is set in motion and then maintained. And that means that we ultimately have to create something like an overall authority to observe, perhaps even supervise this process. In any case, to help guide it. And I think science will have to play an important role here. The way politics works is that decision makers have to become convinced of something themselves first. And that can take quite a long time. It can happen a little bit faster under the pressure of knowledge, but it will then also depend on their making a clear statement in Paris, which will happen in the full glare of the world's media, and that's really important. Politicians say a lot of things, but in the end they have to be judged on what they say. So to this extent, I believe that if the statement is that we need a reduction to zero quite soon after the middle of the century, then the politicians will be reminded of that again and again. I believe we must then also give the policymakers an opportunity to deliver. It would be completely wrong to say to them, you've got to set this process in motion. You made a promise, and we want to see the results in 2 years. After all, we're talking about a transformation of global society in this century. Nothing more, nothing less. No one can predict exactly what the screenplay will look like or how the roles will be distributed. Of course, it would be megalomania to imagine writing a screenplay for something like this. To this extent, the decisive thing is that policymakers take themselves seriously after making statements in Paris. Science can also help them a little. Ultimately, all power stems from the individual. For example, as a consumer, you can decide where you want to shop and what you want to buy. All power stems from the voter, at least in a democratic society. But even in China, party decisions are taken via subcommittees and local party members, etc. All investments are made by individuals, either as small shareholders or by taking their money to a savings bank or paying into a pension scheme. Ultimately, every individual can decide whether they want to be part of the destruction of the world or to help preserve creation. To start with, it's very important that this development towards the stabilization of the global climate is no longer seen solely as something that is negotiated at the highest level of multilateralism, under the umbrella of the United Nations, by 195 or 196 states. This is important, but above all, a great story, a great narrative is being told in Paris and in general, and in the context of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change.
Auch im Sinne von zusätzlichem Druck.
But in addition, there is a grassroots movement of citizens from all nations, which generates additional pressure.
Bürgern aller Nationen,
To this extent, the whole thing is a cosmopolitan movement.
Was auch sehr, sehr wichtig ist, nämlich, dass man sagt,
And it's also very important that we say, we're following the traces that money leaves behind. Where does the money go that is invested on this planet? We want to know where this money actually flows to. And it often flows along totally anonymous routes, some hedge fund managers performing acrobatic tricks on the financial markets. But in the end, it leaves a trace. Something is developing here that can build up a very special moral force. And in a sense, this is the moral mirror that is held up to policymakers. In other words, we want to know what happens to the money that circulates around this planet. Whether this money essentially contributes towards the destruction or strengthening of sustainability. That is divestment, and I believe it will become one of the great movements of the 21st century.
Divestment. Und ich glaube, es wird eine der ganz großen Bewegungen des 21. Jahrhunderts werden.